you ever hear the tragedy of Darth Plagueis the Wise?
The Acolyte is making a huge mistake, one which has repercussions that aren't currently being talked about. Greetings Acolytes, and welcome back to the archives. The witches of Brendok were revealed to have found the secret to creating life within the Force. Mother Anastasia and Mother Coriel openly talked about performing a ritual with their ways of the Force, or as they refer to it as the thread, in order to create the twins, May and Osha.
We were blessed with a miracle! The gift of life!
This is clearly echoing how Plagueis and Sidious were inadvertently responsible for the creation of Anakin in Legends continuity. However, the science of creating life in the Force is not entirely the accomplishment people believe it is, nor is it as easy as the witches make it out to be. In fact, it is literally an affront on the living Force, so much that after Plagueis perfected the art of manipulating the midichlorians, the Force literally began to resist and avoid him. In today's holocron, we are going to be going into the research notes of the revolutionary Plagueis to break down the full process of creating life through the midichlorians, and how Plagueis' breakthrough was actually a detriment to the Force. But not only that, how the witches of Brendok have made a grave mistake in their pursuit of life, one which the Force is not easily going to forgive. So now, let us begin. Plagueis' journey of creating life was not a quick nor an easy one. Unlike most things in the dark side, this one did not come because of his special traits of anger or hatred. The study of Sith alchemy and science required a life's dedication. Plagueis himself was luckily a long-lived species himself, with the capability of living far beyond 100, but even he was well within his elder years before he reached the point of being able to influence the midichlorians. At first, Plagueis attempted to stop people from dying, using a crew as guinea pigs on a ship that he murdered. At that time, he was only able to repair muscle and organ tissue, enough to bring the subjects back to consciousness for a few agonizing moments before they immediately died again. It took a long time of repeated trial and error before Plagueis found a way to actually coerce the midichlorians themselves into doing his will. Plagueis, though, was not satisfied with merely bringing a dead body back to life, as Sith had been performing necromancy spells for millennia, but Plagueis' pursuits were far more refined. In the words of Plagueis himself, "My ultimate goal is the secret of life. That life gives us consciousness, for without consciousness, each of us are nothing. Through science, I will create new life and sustain my own. There is no reason why Darth Plagueis could not live forever." Plagueis' writings explain what the midichlorians are, a conduit of Force energy in all living things, and the energy that gives life. They are directly tied to the life force of their hosts, forming what's called endosymbiosis, meaning that when the host dies, so do the midichlorians, and on the flip side, the host will die if purged of their midichlorians. This is what stunted Plagueis' research for the longest time, not being able to act quickly enough to save someone from death before all of their midichlorians deteriorated first. He experimented many times with attempting to cause the midichlorians to replicate, theoretically causing them to create life. In order to do this though, Plagueis would have to impose his will on the midichlorians through a very specific avenue. The Sith Lord mentions how all of them are connected to one shared consciousness through a fundamental force, a force that Plagueis calls the Pneuma. According to Plagueis, the Force exists and interacts with the universe through three fundamental forces. The Apeiron, which is the realm of things like space, time, gravity, and the cosmos. The Anima, which gives life but not conscious thought to animals, plants, and beings. And the Pneuma, which is the expression of conscious thought. The Force interacts with all things like building blocks and in a unique way with the living Force, specifically having to do with the Anima and the Pneuma, which is where the midichlorians reside. But in the Pneuma, that is where we have to pay attention. Thinking, self-aware minds contribute to the collective, which is accessed by many naturally telepathic species, as well as by various mind tricks of the Jedi and Sith. All effect mind-based powers interact directly with the Pneuma. This is where the midichlorians' unifying consciousness resides. It is the midichlorians themselves. We gave all of that explanation so that we can share exactly how Plagueis describes the art of influencing the midichlorians. This is what he writes. The solution, therefore, is not to introduce new midichlorians, but to impose one's will on the midichlorians already present within the subject. This can be done through the energy of the Pneuma, just as a warrior in peak condition can lift a heavy weight. so can someone with a sharpened mental focus and an affinity of the Force achieve a measurable effect on living cells. Plagueis began his experiments on small rodents, using his will amplified through his body's own midichlorians to override their lesser concentrated counts and voices, though it proved more challenging than he had predicted. Because midichlorians are linked by a universal mind, the midichlorians in Plagueis' own cells seem to resist the imposition upon their fellows. Luke Skywalker adds his own annotation within Plagueis' notes, where he says that the one factor that Plagueis could not measure was the will of the Force. This explains the resistance to Plagueis' perversion of life. But Luke also adds that he didn't believe the Force ever felt compelled to speak to Plagueis, and that the Force actually hated him for obvious reasons. Plagueis would eventually succeed in his quest though, first with animals and then with people. He forced the midichlorians to override their natural life cycles, and what he discovered was that they would draw upon the Force in order to sustain themselves, thus halting tissue decay on a microscopic level, putting an end to aging and all disease. Once Plagueis could halt aging, he discovered he could go much further. He surmised that in theory, they could be induced to create life on a molecular level, perhaps even causing the cells of a mother to be persuaded to create a zygote. And here's where we finally reach the meat and potatoes. All of Plagueis' research up until this point was simply to gain a mastery of the midichlorians so as to perpetuate his own life and to stop others from dying or bring them back. If this wasn't bad enough though, the mad scientist was ready to actually create a new life inside of a mother, forcing herself to cooperate into creating life. As an aside, assuming the witches of Brendok came anywhere close to this level of research, it would be surprising to say the very least. Plagueis had access to a self-made state-of-the-art laboratory, centuries of Sith knowledge, and the money to access all of the test subjects he could ever desire. The Brendok witches live on a frontier forest world, among people we assume they care too much about to experiment on, in a castle made of flammable stone. Inconsistencies aside, we'll revisit the witches in a moment in order to explain not only does it not make sense for them to have done this, but why it was a massive mistake. But as for Plagueis, we're just getting started. Plagueis would obtain hundreds of identical humanoids, each with a consistent midichlorian count. After experiments, he succeeded in prodding the midichlorians to replicate themselves through asexual fission, though in most cases this process increased the numbers uncontrollably and would kill the host. For a short amount of time, Plagueis gave up on this experiment, but he would write this. But I believe that by using this method, I can trick midichlorians into creating a zygote. Then it would simply be a matter of growing the subject under normal biological conditions. Such a subject could, of course, take years to hit the developmental milestones of a typical humanoid, but he could have a midichlorian count as high as 20,000 per cell. This is more than any Jedi or Sith in recorded history. Although entirely theoretical, such an achievement is intriguing to me. Right now, it is unknown whether or not Luke is aware that Anakin was a product of the Force rejecting a dark side ritual, but he did have a reaction to this information written by Plagueis. At the bottom of the page, Luke would write this: "I cannot help feeling a chill as I read this account by Plagueis, knowing that my father was known for his high midichlorian count, which was supposedly even higher than that of Yoda's." Darth Plagueis would eventually return to this experiment, just as he did the first. He started with animals and smaller creatures. For an extremely long period of time, Plagueis became reclusive within his laboratory, endlessly experimenting. Eventually, he would take Palpatine through his lab a single time, where there were rows upon rows of creatures within tubes. Sidious would be dumbfounded when he saw that his master had revealed each of them were created using only the Force. But Plagueis would issue a warning. Plagueis says this: "I failed to exercise due caution as we attempt to wrest the powers of life and death from the Force. As we seek to tip the balance, the Force resists our efforts, action and reaction. Something akin to the laws of thermodynamics." Yet despite knowing this, Sidious and Plagueis moved forward with the ritual that would change galactic history. The two had succeeded in willing the Force to shift and tip irrevocably towards the dark side. Not a mere paradigm shift, but a tangible alteration that could be felt by anyone in the Force. The shift had been the outcome of months of meditation, during which Plagueis and Sidious had sought to challenge the Force, to gain sovereignty, and to poison the galaxy with the dark side. Coming together as a single entity, Plagueis and Sidious brought the power of their will to bear, and asserted sovereignty over the Force, something that had never been done before. Suddenly, in a moment, the Force yielded to them, and they believed that they had won. The balance of the light and dark side had suddenly tipped to cast a veil over the light of the Jedi, and plunging the Force into darkness. The novel then tells us that Plagueis, now drunk on this new power, had attempted to then bring it into a creation of life. Not just some animal, but a Force-sensitive person. He would then literally stretch out with his will to inform every being of his existence on a psychological level, and impact them all, whether of his own species, insectoid, human, free, or slave. At first, Plagueis felt nothing, and believed that he had ultimately failed, though he wasn't bothered by this, since he had conquered death, and was currently reversing his own aging process. But a terrible series of events then occurred. The Force grew completely silent, as if in flight from him, and all of the created beings in the lab instantly succumbed to horrifying diseases and passed. The Force was done with Plagueis, just as he had predicted, and it resisted him and used his powers to bring into life a being that would bring balance to the Force and destroy the Sith. The Force reached across the galaxy to a humble slave woman on Tatooine, completed what Plagueis had tried to do for the dark side, but instead, for the light, the chosen one of the Jedi, Anakin Skywalker, was conceived. And now at long last we reached the problem. All of this work, time, effort, and clear abrasion to the living Force, Plagueis had done this in order to achieve mastery over life and death, and thus caused the Force to reject him in such a dramatic way that it literally created the Chosen One prophecy. The two Sith, less than a decade before the Battle of Naboo, had shifted the balance and provoked the Force to lash out. This was no mere dark side experiment, but an unheard perversion of life itself. Concerning what the witches of Brendok did is no small feat. All of Plagueis' methods that we just went through explaining is a strenuous process, having the Force on a microscopic level, using it to the point where no other forceful being has ever attempted. It's not something that can just be mentioned in a throwaway line. This action is a terrible thing in the realm of the Force. The witches believe they can just pluck the strands of the thread as they please with no regard to cause and effect, and in doing so, have created two unnatural lives. They don't seem to understand the fundamentals of the Force, which is that it is a living energy. Creating life like this completely impacts the greater balance of the cosmos, not just one person's ovaries. I believe the real problem with this choice in the Acolyte is that not only does it undermine Anakin's origins, but it also cheapens the accomplishment of Plagueis. He was the first and the only person to do this, and it required years upon years of trial and error, with more repeated failures than successes to accomplish his goal. And even then, he didn't succeed in creating Anakin on purpose. His success was attributed to the Force rejecting his trial, rejecting all of his work. Creating life through the Force should never be an easy thing to do. It's already problematic to twist existing life to the ways of the Sith alchemists and Night Sisters. What would have been better at least is if they had written Plagueis to actually be involved in this process. But at the end of the day, what the witches had done and what Plagueis did in Legends continuity is not a good or a virtuous thing. It is an affront on the Force, made by an evil villain, a Dark Lord of the Sith. But anyway, my friends, Sidious has been on record as stating that he believes that the Sith have grown past the use of a lightsaber, and that he only wields one to simply mock the Jedi that pride them so deeply. Darth Sidious' Force feats need no introduction or explanation. However, with him, somebody that has this opinion of the lightsaber and lightsaber combat, to be as deadly and proficient as he is, a master of killing and a master of the blade, does require a deep, in-depth explanation. And today, Acolytes of the Force and students of the galaxy, let us open up another holocron, take a look at Darth Sidious' mindset during a duel and his training under his master Darth Plagueis, and break down exactly why Darth Sidious was such a deadly and proficient lightsaber duelist, so skilled in an art that he in reality cared very little for. It is in the Darth Plagueis novel where there are a few very brief lines where Plagueis explains to Sidious the importance of lightsaber combat. Plagueis looks at his apprentice as he is drilling with the blade and says this: "Your reactions must be instantaneous and nothing less than lethal, for you are a Sith Lord and have been marked for death." Darth Sidious is one of the most skilled people to ever touch the lightsaber. He absolutely embarrassed 3 Jedi Masters, and went toe-to-toe with Mace Windu and Grandmaster Yoda. Grandmaster Yoda, who he appeared to stalemate, and Mace Windu, depending on who you ask, may have actually deceived. With that said, it's incredible that Darth Sidious, a master with the blade, would later go on to tell Vader that he only used a lightsaber to mock the Jedi, was so insanely skilled, so much in fact that he butchered and dismantled Savage Opress, as well as handily defeated Maul. What's incredible about Darth Sidious's lightsaber skill and ascension to a point of power is the fact that he had very limited training partners as a young Sith apprentice. In fact, one of the only partners he had would have been his master in Plagueis, and unfortunately for us in the lore, we have very little of Darth Plagueis, other than a few lines in his book and comments from Tenebrous that states that Darth Plagueis is indeed a master of all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, a comment that he would also give to his own apprentice in Sidious, stating that he too was a master of all 7 forms. I think the most answers that we'll end up finding about Darth Sidious's training will have to do with his own training methods with individuals such as Maul. Unlike his later apprentices in Dooku and Vader, Maul was an uncrafted opponent and an uncrafted lightsaber wielder, so how exactly did Darth Sidious train Maul? And is this indicative of how Sidious himself was trained? One of Sidious's favorite things to do with Maul was to actually put him up against some of the most highly advanced droids that the galaxy had to offer, not to mention doing so in isolated places, leading us to infer that this is also something that Sidious likely endured himself. Even later on, it was revealed that Darth Vader himself would duel against droids, only this time he would duel against droids that he had a specific hand in creating, having implanted within them various forms of lightsaber combat that would change and adapt on the fly, similar to the likes of Grievous, and Vader did so in order to hone his craft specifically on how to take out Jedi that he was hunting at the time. It is here where we see a key difference between the Jedi and the Sith. While the Jedi most of the time practice against their masters, or other young initiates or Padawans, the Sith have no other choice. They are forced to either duel their masters specifically, or go against combat droids. But, make no mistake, the Sith do put just as much of an emphasis on lightsaber combat as the Jedi do. We are aware that the Sith utilizing droids during the Rule of Two era for their training was not a new thing, and that nearly every single one of them did utilize a droid of some time to hone their skill in lightsaber combat, leading us obviously to infer that also Darth Sidious participated in this common practice. But with that addressed, there is one individual that plays a much more crucial role in the training of Sidious than any droid ever could. We have to look at his master in Plagueis. What's unique about Darth Plagueis is he has been on record as stating that he doesn't particularly enjoy lightsaber duels nor lightsaber combat, and it is this belief within Darth Plagueis that also leads to Sidious's belief that they have grown beyond lightsabers. However, this is not to say that Darth Plagueis was not a formidable duelist at all. In fact, he was quite formidable. As stated earlier, Darth Tenebrous, Plagueis' own master, stated that Plagueis had now officially completed all 7 forms of lightsaber combat, and even so, mastered all of them to near perfection. Beyond this, unlike Plagueis, it is heavily known that Darth Tenebrous loved lightsaber combat and was highly proficient at it. But what about Darth Plagueis' specific feats? Well, one of the only major lightsaber encounters that Plagueis was involved in is actually one that is highly impressive. Underneath his nose, Darth Tenebrous, his own master, trained another apprentice, another Bith, by the name of Darth Venomous. Venomous was specifically trained to take out Plagueis, someone who Tenebrous, Plagueis' own master, secretly loathed. Unfortunately for us, the Darth Plagueis novel does not detail a ton of training about Darth Sidious. However, it does detail 3 specific events that shaped Sidious as a dark side wielder, as well as specifically a lightsaber wielder. Darth Plagueis realized the importance of Sidious in himself as the culmination of the Rule of Two. These 2 Sith Lords had a different mindset from the Sith that predated them. They were aware and ready to fulfill the prophecy of the Rule of Two and seize the galaxy, and Plagueis knew that he needed to prepare Sidious. The first of these 3 major trials occurred as a sort of hunt. During the hunt, the Sith Lords were only armed with vibroblades, not lightsabers, but this was meant to give them a distinct disadvantage. The hunt occurred on the planet known as Buoyant, whose atmosphere had been terraformed decades earlier. What resulted was a planet spinning more rapidly than is normal. What this did was cause two very specific things that Plagueis had in mind. The animals were far faster than is normal for the Star Wars galaxy, and their movements were more unpredictable. The exact things that Plagueis wanted to shape in Sidious. Darth Plagueis referred to this act as a summoning, and that leads us to another thing. The dark side of the Force and lightsaber combat go hand in hand perfectly. As Darth Bane and Revan explained, lightsaber combat was actually more linked to the dark side of the Force than the Jedi ever realized. They could use the dark side of the Force to literally fuel their blade, making them faster, making their movements more precise and more deadly. And this is the exact mindset that Plagueis needed to instill in Darth Sidious. And one of the major advantages that Sidious has in a duel against the Jedi, he is using the full might of the dark side of the Force as perhaps one of the most perfect avatars of the dark side to fuel his every movement, with that being the purpose of this exercise given to him by Plagueis. Through this, not only was Sidious looking for the dark side, but he also became massively attractive to the dark side itself. For Darth Sidious's second trial, the droids played another major role, as Higo Damask, or Darth Plagueis, ordered 200 battle droids to be delivered to a desolate world. This next test would occur on the world of Hypori. For this next lesson imparted on Sidious, this would be about defense, forcing the Dark Lord of the Sith, who typically give into aggression and anger and fuel their blade too offensively, to learn defense. Facing 200 battle droids as a sole man, Darth Sidious was forced to fall back onto Form 3 Sarisu and more defensive maneuvers of the blade, not to mention that the sheer number of battle droids meant that every move that Sidious made had to be flawless and near perfect, taking out as many droids as he could in quick succession. And the final test for Darth Sidious would occur on the world known as Cursed. Cursed was a world at many centuries before the fall of the Republic. The location of it was deleted from all Jedi and Republic records, and starting in the year 654 BBY, it was frequently visited by members of the Sith Order. On the occasions of their visits, the Sith sought battle with the Cursed natives in an arid plateau on part of the planet where they had landed, and engaged large numbers of them in combat in order to hone their skills. Despite the hostile intentions of the Sith, a cult centered around this periodic returns of the Sky Visitors eventually developed as a part of the culture, and the natives of the world of Cursed had prepared for centuries to battle every generation of Sith. This was Sidious's final test, to destroy a people whose only goal was to destroy the Sith themselves in a ritualistic combat. The same location where Darth Plagueis was deemed worthy by Darth Tenebrous, so too would Sidious, and Sidious did so brilliantly, taking out wave after wave of enemy. The strongest, most fit, terrifying natives of the world all fell to the blade of Darth Sidious and the Sith. And with that, when Darth Plagueis states that Sidious is a true master of the blade, he is correct. And with all of this, it makes sense why Sidious would not be able to only compete with the greatest swordsmen of the Jedi, but in many cases, more than once, outright embarrass them. And this is why Darth Sidious is truly one of the most formidable and skilled lightsaber wielders in all of the lore. But anyway, my friends, would Darth Plagueis the Wise do the seemingly impossible? Could he heal the wounds of Lord Vader? Greetings, Acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the Archives. The first Sith Lord to have found the secret to manipulating the midichlorians, Plagueis, was a man whose work is largely misunderstood and shrouded in great mystery and darkness. His ability to create life through mastering the midichlorians was something that we have never seen before. It was Plagueis' goal to achieve immortality through this process, thereby eschewing the need for essence transfer, or horrific rituals that would leave one in a state of agony. On the road to eternal life, Plagueis would find that many things could be done when influencing the midichlorians. Namely, Darth Plagueis learned the ability to replicate life itself and to heal brutal grave injuries. This naturally led us to wonder if it was entirely possible that had Plagueis been alive, would he have been able to restore Anakin after his burning on Mustafar? To do this, we quickly got to work on our research, looking up the scientific breakthroughs of Darth Plagueis in depth to see what he could have accomplished. And after searching, it is our belief that Plagueis would have been able to save Vader from his black armored fate. So join us today as we open a holocron and dig through the research journal of Darth Plagueis and explain exactly why and how he would have saved Vader in a way that Sidious never could have. As we know, the diagnosis of the Chosen One's fate was very problematic, having now all 4 of his limbs severed and sustained burns down to his organs. So much living tissue of Anakin's body had been utterly destroyed. Because midichlorians inhabit living cells, when a sufficient amount of those cells are irretrievably lost, it will cut the user's force potential down a few notches. Typically, a limb or a hand severed here or there doesn't cause too much of a drop in potential, since the count is insignificant. But in Anakin Skywalker's case, when that much organic tissue was lost, first his limbs, then the burning of his tissue, this resulted in a dramatic loss in midichlorians and thus potential. As it was stated, Anakin should have been able to become the most powerful Force wielder in history, but he was cut down to merely 80% of not his own power, but Palpatine's, while Sidious himself insisted that Vader's power blockages were mostly that of mental. We know that even if Vader were to bypass his emotional barriers, he would still never have the power that he should have had, and that's all thanks to Darth Sidious's mismanagement of Vader's treatment. Despite having all of the Darth Plagueis research notes, Sidious admitted that he didn't understand his master's work, and evidently never took the time to attempt to learn it. Plagueis had nearly mastered the way of influencing the midichlorians, successfully recreating life, and coming within a breath of achieving the immortality that all Sith desired. But Sidious never replicated his master's experiments, and didn't much care for the idea of manipulating the midichlorians. Instead, Sidious would use the research to fuel experiments in creating mutants and monsters, but nothing else. This turned out to be a massive mistake and a massive waste, as Plagueis' research could have saved the power of the Chosen One had Palpatine tried, and there was great power there that Palpatine never learned. Let's assume for a moment that Plagueis made it to the events of Revenge of the Sith. We won't go into too much detail about a what-if scenario, as this video is not meant to be a fanfiction, but more so an exploration on this specific moment in history. Plagueis had a very different idea for how he was going to build his Sith Empire, and because of this, he would have managed the Clone Wars very differently. Let's say for a moment that Sidious didn't kill his master, but instead decided to imprison him, only bringing him out whenever it suited the Dark Lord's purposes. Everything goes as it normally would until we get to the Duel of Mustafar. Instead of flying Vader back to Coruscant where he would be mutilated further by machines and outdated technology, Sidious takes him to a secret Sith world where Plagueis is being held prisoner. Palpatine orders his former master to heal Vader, or else. So, from what we've learned, how does Plagueis do it? Looking into his research notes from his journal, we have discovered a certain section, one that convinces us beyond a shadow of a doubt that the Sith scientist has this taken care of, and has this mastered. Plagueis had originally tried the idea of a blood transfusion, but found the host's body native midichlorians that rejected the influx of foreign cells. His natural solution was not to introduce new midichlorians, but to impose his will on the midichlorians already present within any given subject. It would take incredible mental acuity, but Plagueis would succeed in the process of using the Force on a microscopic level. This is possible, as many Jedi Masters and Sith Lords had the ability to do the same, doing so in order to create holocrons. Those subatomic nudges in the Force are possible with extreme focus. Plagueis had achieved this focus by practicing on rodents and other small creatures with a basic amount of midichlorians, and he had found this process difficult at first, stating that his own native midichlorians were rejecting his attempts to force them into imposing their fellows, due to the fact that all midichlorians are linked by a universal mind. Plagueis' midichlorians turned against those of the small creatures. However, his will would soon supersede theirs, and he would successfully manipulate any given subject. Let's read now from what Plagueis says in his notes. Eventually I succeeded, first with small creatures, then with slaves purchased from the Hutts. I forced the midichlorians to override their natural life cycles. What I discovered is that these midichlorians could not die. Instead, they drew upon sustaining force energy, which acted on a microscopic level to halt tissue decay in their hosts, putting an end to aging and disease. With this knowledge, Plagueis would have been able to save Vader from dying, and even halted the destruction process of his body so it wouldn't get any worse. Later in Plagueis' notes though, the Sith scientists admittedly had trouble when it came to replicating the midichlorians. He had done it a few times with non-force sensitive subjects, but the results were catastrophic. The midichlorians had multiplied uncontrollably, and thus resulted in the death of the hosts. However, we know that in Darth Plagueis' novel, he had successfully done this with another Sith in Darth Venomous, as Plagueis was able to bring Venomous back to life over and over again at will. Plagueis was able to do it without trying, to the point where he was just having fun with it. With this knowledge, Plagueis would have easily been able to influence the midichlorians of Anakin's body to flood over the damaged tissue, restoring it all from the burns. It would likely be a grisly process, with Anakin's life hanging by a thread, but Plagueis could have done it. This would restore the damaged tissue, and not only his flesh, but his lungs as well, negating the need for a respirator, life support system, and a helmet, as this process would also likely restore Anakin's eyes, ears, and his vocal cords. It's possible that he might even be able to grow his hair back, but on the subject of Anakin's limbs, this is a little bit of a different story. Plagueis would not be able just to have Anakin regenerate his legs and arms. That would likely require a transfusion, which would be much more difficult, as the natural solution, of course, is cloning his limbs. In a holocron we released a few days ago though, we talked about why Vader didn't clone his limbs, with the reason largely being the fact that cloning force-sensitive tissue was extremely difficult. There was a risk in the limbs being unstable and not working with the force properly due to how the midichlorians would act differently. However, only with Imperial science did Darth Vader find these weaknesses, not Darth Plagueis' eyes. With Plagueis, all of that worry is thrown out the window. The Sith was a mad scientist fully aware of the midichlorians' resistance to replication, and this is why we believe Plagueis would be able to use his abilities in tandem with the cloning process to ensure that the midichlorians obeyed and replicated properly. Then, he could surgically graft the limbs back onto Anakin's body, causing the cells to properly mend with one another to feel just as natural. We even believe that he could restore Anakin's right hand. But now, my friends, the Sith Order are the group of beings that are most famous by far for representing the use of the dark side in Star Wars. However, we know that there were beings that predated their order by tens of thousands of years. This ancient order would be known as the Rakata, also known as the Infinite Empire. Interestingly, we don't very often get a Sith's perspective on the other dark side religions, as they typically believe all others to either be rivals or inferior. However, the Rakatan ways were the foundation for how the Sith would eventually operate, so it would stand to reason that the Sith would form some kind of opinion about them. Did they respect their predecessors or their accomplishments, or did they shun them? Did they think the Rakata to be weak and foolish for how they let their empire slip through their fingertips? Well, we do know how one Sith Lord spoke rather highly of the Rakata, and that would be none other than Darth Plagueis. But it would be Plagueis' admiration of the Rakatan Empire that would actually clue us into a deeper part of his character, one that may reveal why Plagueis cares so much about the ruling of the galaxy, and why he believes he should be the Emperor. So my friends, let's open this holocron and examine why Plagueis thought so highly of the Rakata. This is actually an extremely important event, as Darth Plagueis very rarely had anything positive to say about any other darkside organization. Even more shocking than this, he very rarely had anything nice to say about the ancient Sith. In fact, he largely considered them to be fools, individuals that led their golden empire into the ground, and Darth Plagueis held far more respect for the Rakata than the ancient Sith. A fascinating revelation. Our source today comes from the Darth Plagueis novel and takes place during the training of Darth Sidious. Plagueis explains to his student the dichotomy of the Jedi ways and how it is different from that of the Sith. Plagueis begins to go into detail about the ancients, going all the way back to the beginnings with Ashla and Bogan, the two moons that lay over the Jedi's home world, Ashla representing the light, Bogan the dark, echoing back to the original Jedi's belief of balance in the Force. This is what Plagueis says. But Ashla is a perversion, for the dark has always preceded the light. The original idea was to capture the power of the Force and to make it subservient to the will of sentient life. The Ancients, the Celestials, the Rakata, didn't pronounce judgment on their works. They moved planets, organized star systems, conjured dark side devices like the Starforge as they saw fit. If millions died in this process, so be it. The lives of most beings are small consequences. The Jedi have failed to understand this. They are so busy saving lives and striving to keep the power of the Force in balance that they have lost sight of the fact that sentient life is meant to evolve, not simply languish in contented stasis. The wisdom Plagueis displays to us is that he greatly admired the Ancients. They had a drive to constantly evolve and to change the galaxy as they saw fit as it evolved with them. If something was out of place or simply needed to be changed, the power of the Force could be used to change that and to better the galaxy. Plagueis believed that the light side, or Ashla, is a perversion, a foolish attempt for the Jedi to maintain things as they already are, to stop this evolution. In this way, Plagueis views the Jedi as quite villainous. Plagueis believes that he has been called by the forces of the universe and has been tasked with the mission to bring much needed change, to force the galaxy to evolve, better itself, and grow. Plagueis even believes that this is the natural state of the galaxy, and that the race of the Rakata understood this, but that the Jedi stepped in and stopped the rightful change of the galaxy. In this way, the more drastic among those in the archives may see that Plagueis has a point. Plagueis has aligned his ideals in the Force. He is a scientist. Discovery and evolution are the primary goals of all scientific research, especially what Plagueis was interested in. The Dark Lord sought to conquer the very fundamental truth of life and death. No matter how much the Force worked against him, Plagueis would not be stopped. He believed that the Force is to be made a beast of burden, a slave to the will of the sentient in order to make the galaxy progress. To Plagueis, this is exactly what the ancient Rakata were striving for when they were crafting the Infinite Empire. The Infinite Empire existed in an era in time before the existence of any republic. This was an era of great progression for the galaxy, as many species were just now discovering interstellar travel. The idea of traveling through hyperspace had not yet been developed. The Rakatan Empire were the workers and the engineers of the ancient species known as the Celestials. They were the ones who crafted the Starforge, and as Plagueis mentions, because of this they had knowledge of how to create technology, but of a very important kind. Technology that was powered by the way of the Force. The Rakata implemented the dark side of the Force in their inventions, which made them powerful but somewhat unstable. Still though, they were the pioneers of a network of brand new technological advancement. When we said all of their technology was powered by the Force, we meant it. From their ships, to their weaponry, to their Force-based hyperdrives. The Rakata used the dark side to advance their society thousands of years into the future by the standards of that era. And it was with this hyperdrive technology that they were able to conquer a great portion of the galaxy. But the Rakata had a flaw. The Force-powered hyperdrives could only lock onto systems sufficiently strong in the Force. This means they could only travel to those systems and not the neighboring ones. What resulted was the Infinite Empire being spread out very sparsely, and this would play a major role in the Empire's fall, as the systems they had controlled were very isolated, leaving them open, vulnerable to attack. But as Plagueis said, he understood that this failure was simply a product of their time. The Rakata were strong enough and experienced enough in the dark side to make change as they willed, and make change they did, as it was because of the Infinite Empire that the Sith pureblood species of Korriban would be corrupted and eventually led to the dark side forever. The Rakata were the forefathers of the Sith themselves. They brought the knowledge to the doorstep of the Sith, and the Sith Order was therefore created. Later, it was Rakatan where the first normal hyperdrives were developed, thus causing the formation of the Galactic Republic. They were the forefathers of the galaxy itself. It was their Force saber that inspired the ancient Jedi to switch from metal swords to creating the first lightsabers. But despite the domino effect that the Rakata had on the entire galaxy, there were still many superweapons existing in space. The Starforge is one that immediately comes to mind, weapons that the Rakatans had built. The one that Revan and Malak used to nearly successfully take over the galaxy for themselves. With all of that said, it is now understandable why Plagueis respected the Empire so immensely. They did everything in the name of evolution, not concerned with consequences, laws, the rules of lesser beings. They were in charge. They were superior. They made the rules. They reorganized planets, enslaved, or cannibalized anyone who they subjugated. This, to Plagueis, was the dream that the Sith Empire had in mind for thousands of years. Many of the ancient Sith shunned the Rakata. They did not seek out their knowledge, their technology. But Darth Plagueis shunned the ancient Sith, and Plagueis very much did seek out the ancient Rakatan knowledge. He pointed out to Sidious the massive leaps in knowledge and technology that the Rakatans had over the entire galaxy, and how, in direct contrast, the Jedi had accomplished so little, stopped the galaxy from evolving even, now laid claim to the great foundation that the Rakatans had left behind. Sidious shares the same sentiment. The Jedi have such power, and yet they do nothing with it. They have the power to change, and yet they refuse to inflict change on the galaxy. They could alter history for an entire world. They could become a god if they wanted to, and yet they never do. Plagueis says that the Jedi have completely stunted the progression of the galaxy to let millions of beings die in the betterment for billions upon trillions of them, and the evolution of the galaxy is a sacrifice Plagueis would make, doing all of this in the name of the betterment of the galaxy and its society. I always appreciate the insights of the Sith, and ones that are not just straight up evil or a will to rule. Interestingly, these more noble sounding motivations always provide complexity to those who seek the path of the darkness. We all know that the dark side corrupts even the most pure of intentions, and those who wish to be heroes may be seduced by the power that it offers, causing them to do the most depraved things in the name of progress. I need to make one thing clear. Plagueis was undoubtedly evil to his core, and had no real care for others. But he did find the philosophical debate an interesting one. It was this businessman and the scientist side of him that deeply desired the galaxy to evolve what they had become. He sees the galaxy at large crawling through progression, and he truly believes it a sad reality in compared to the power that the galaxy could have had. It's an interesting pitch for a man that is pure evil. But anyway, my friends, who was the absolutely horrific Dark Lord of the Sith that taught Darth Plagueis? Why was he possibly one of the most evil Sith Lords that had ever lived? And why was his death so terrifying and horrific that it turned out to be one of the most grotesque and unsettling moments in all of the Star Wars mythos? Lord Plagueis was one of the most prominent members of the Rule of Two, coming in behind that, of course, of Bane and Sidious. Plagueis was one of the few Sith Lords that actually got his own novel and expanded works. Plagueis would make himself quite famous, or perhaps infamous, due to his very contrarian views on the Force and the Sith Order. But more than this, Plagueis being the Sith who actually discovered how to cheat death. But every great and powerful Dark Lord starts somewhere, and where Plagueis began was with his own master, a master named Darth Tenebrous. We only ever directly encounter Plagueis' master in the very first chapter of his novel. Everything we learn about him is told in retrospect and from other sources. But like all Sith, we have found Tenebrous to be quite unique in both his approach to the dark side as well as his grand plan, which was different from Plagueis', a plan to completely decimate the Jedi. But beyond this, his fate left us absolutely speechless. So my friends, let's discuss the life and character behind Darth Plagueis the Wise, as we examine the deeds of Tenebrous the Cruel. The being that would become Darth Tenebrous originally went by the name of Rugus Gnome before he was given his Sith name by his master. We don't know much about his life prior to Sithhood, or even who trained Tenebrous other than it was a male Twi'lek of an unknown name. But what we do know is about the grand plan that Tenebrous and his master concocted together. It would be around this generation of the Rule of Two when the Sith were beginning to sense the completion of the grand plan. And in the coming generation, or perhaps even this generation, the Sith would again gain control of the galaxy. This was a very pivotal moment for the Rule of Two, as they had spent centuries gaining power, but they now had to decide how to wield that power, how to interweave all the spies and connections in the Republic in order to topple it completely. Something that later Plagueis and his master would find in common was that they both had an aptitude for science. At this point in history, the Sith had comfortably began integrating their normal daily lives into their pursuit of the dark side and its knowledge. This was yet another way how the Sith had evolved past the Jedi, No more were they religious zealots trying to fight a war of strength of numbers or combat ability alone. Rather, Tenebrous' generation of Sith had embraced the fact that while they were indeed still Sith, they had become very powerful members of society as well. In the future, Sidious would use the dark side in tandem with his political stance to topple the Jedi for good. And as a banker, Plagueis would start financing certain political bills in the Trade Federation. This ultimately would result in a spark that would conclude in the Clone Wars. But with Tenebrous and his master, they believed that somewhere within their grand laboratories was the key to the Jedi's undoing. Tenebrous' plan was to concoct a virus that they could unleash on the Jedi Order. The idea behind the virus was that it would infect the Order and cause a pandemic only among Force sensitives, with the result either concluding in death or the pathogen severing the Jedi from the Force. To me, this seems like a drastic and a terrifying prospect. The idea of a Force-based bioweapon is horrendous, especially one that threatens to sever anyone from the Force entirely. Luckily for the Jedi though the experiment was ultimately a failure and was never seen to completion, it would be sometime after this, or perhaps because of this, that Tenebrous no longer saw his master as useful, and therefore removed him. After taking the mantle of the Dark Lord for himself, Tenebrous began manufacturing machines and weapons of terror, believing that one day, technology would simply render the Force obsolete. He believed that he could grow so powerful that he would no longer need the Force at all. By strength of military might and super weapons, Tenebrous would take the galaxy by storm. The Force would finally be surpassed. How arrogant of him. Tenebrous, in fact, became fascinated with the prospect of growing beyond the need for the Force. Unlike nearly all the Sith that came before him, Tenebrous refused to believe that the Force was some sort of all-encompassing, all-powerful entity. He didn't particularly like the idea of the Force as it was written by the Sith and Jedi alike. His logical mind refuted the idea of something so mystical and out of reach that he could never fully control it. As time went on, Tenebrous decided to use the Force as a useful energy source to be used to fuel his experiments, an ideology that we have seen passed down to Darth Plagueis, the two of them being some of the most arrogant Sith in the entire timeline. Reading the passages in Plagueis' chapter in the Book of the Sith will explain how he truly viewed the Force, which we can apply to Tenebrous and how he viewed it as well. They didn't truly believe in the will or the mysticism of the Force at all, with Plagueis not believing in Sith spirits. Because of this, they did grow powerful, but this arrogance ultimately stopped them short of what they truly could have become. I believe that the dark side decided to keep certain secrets from Tenebrous and Plagueis because they did not respect it entirely, unlike Sidious, who would come later, who gave massive respect to the dark arts. When Plagueis visited Korriban, all of the Sith spirits refused to commune with him because they believed he was a heretic, unworthy of even their presence. A surprising revelation that had it not been Sidious to get the Sith back on track, the Sith very much were falling away from who they were meant to be. But back to Tenebrous and his personal life. Darth Tenebrous would continue his persona as Rugus Gnome and be a lead engineer designer of some of the best and most luxurious starships that the galaxy had ever seen. This made him extremely wealthy and put him in the place to become great friends with the head of the intergalactic banking clan, an individual by the name of Kar Damask. Tenebrous sensed that Kar had a good amount of Force potential and midichlorians within him, but just falling short of what Tenebrous was looking for. Tenebrous, though, also knew of another Moon, a female, who too was reasonably gifted in the aptitude of the Force. Desiring for the two of them to create a powerful Force-sensitive offspring, Tenebrous manipulated the Moons into having an affair, which resulted in the spawning of one Higo Damask. Later on in the young boy's childhood, Tenebrous convinced Kar to let him take the boy on as a protege, but in truth, this was the training of what would one day result in Darth Plagueis. At first, Tenebrous trained Plagueis quite classically, to the point where his aptitude with the Force, as well as his skill with the lightsaber, was quite impressive, and beyond any Jedi Knight of the time. Although both master and apprentice regarded the lightsaber as more of a homage to a bygone era, and became skilled with it more so out of tradition than anything else. Although Plagueis would remember that Tenebrous would enjoy a good sparring match, and that the two would spar often, if nothing more for entertainment for the Dark Lord. Through these sessions, Plagueis grew to understand that he was a generational talent with the blade, and that at a very young age was encroaching upon his master in skill with the lightsaber. But as always, this meant nothing to Tenebrous. It was the intellectual pursuits of the dark side that he cared about, and this too grew to be Plagueis' obsession. By now, the race to immortality among the Sith had become more emphasized, with them sensing the unfolding of a grand plan. Any one of them could be the final Sith Emperor to rule eternally. Although their plans had been delayed for centuries, a ray of light had presented itself to them. One dark night, Tenebrous had a vision that the chosen one of the Jedi prophecy would soon make himself known to the galaxy. Terrified that this chosen one would hunt him down, seek him out throughout the stars, and destroy him in a desperate grab for life itself, Tenebrous came up with a plan. His first step was an issue with Plagueis. He knew that his apprentice was growing in power, and needed to seek out another apprentice that would be more subservient to his will. He appreciated Plagueis to be sure, but he needed an apprentice that was perhaps less ambitious, and willing to serve as his right-hand man rather than succeeding him as the Sith Emperor. Tenebrous then began the training of another young Bith, who he named Darth Venomous. He then began researching his own method of immortality behind Plagueis' back, creating something known as the Maxi-Chlorians. This went unnoticed for months, and Darth Tenebrous' plan nearly came to fruition. But Plagueis would turn on him in a moment that he least expected. On a trip to the planet Baldemnik, Tenebrous and Plagueis went inside the mines to search for some Cortosis ore. Along the way though, one of the mining droids had suddenly exploded, having been sabotaged by an unknown assailant. Tenebrous managed to contain the explosion with the Force, but while he was focusing, Plagueis caused the ceiling above him to collapse, crushing Tenebrous under large stones. As he lay dying, he was hit with the revelation that would be followed by pure rage. It was Plagueis that had betrayed him. At the very beginning, he was proud, even impressed with his apprentice's cunning, but his pride quickly turned to an utter loathing. The rubble had destroyed the very ship that the two Sith Lords had arrived on, leaving Plagueis stranded on a world that required him to wear an envirosuit, a world where he could very likely be killed. Plagueis had risked the entire future of the Sith just to kill Tenebrous. Tenebrous would meet his physical end as Plagueis approached him and then snapped his neck, displeased with his master's sour reception. This would have been the end for Tenebrous had he not completed his experiment. His own pseudo-version of essence transfer had been enacted, and using his knowledge of the failed virus, Tenebrous created a new virus that contained the Maxi-Chlorians. The best way to describe what a Maxi-Chlorian is to call them something like artificial vessels for Force energies. By using this virus, he had preserved his consciousness within the Maxi-Chlorians, and as they left his body, they fled to the closest living thing, the body of Darth Plagueis. And completely unbeknownst to Plagueis, his master would live within him. But in order to do this, Tenebrous had sacrificed something precious, his ability to sense the motion of the future. The master had believed that he would no longer need this, as his future was certain. His ultimate plan was to possess the prophesied chosen one whenever he was discovered, perfecting essence transfer, and doing so when the chosen one was still very young and unable to resist the Dark Lord. This would give Tenebrous access to a body with a historic amount of midichlorians, and therefore ultimate power. Ironically, Tenebrous had bet everything on the powers of the Force. As his physical body died, Tenebrous entered his apprentice's body and slipped into his very cells, infecting them with his Maxi-Chlorians. But as the infection spread, Tenebrous again gained access to Plagueis' powers of foresight, and in this single moment, he discovered and felt Plagueis' own death at the hands of his apprentice, who Tenebrous could only see as a smear of darkness. The vision horrified him, and now knowing that Plagueis would die soon, leaving Tenebrous unable to fulfill his ultimate goal, he began to panic. Tenebrous decided to escape Plagueis' body to think about a way out, to discover a new path. But as he exited, he discovered his own mummified remains. Time had passed, possibly decades, centuries even, but Tenebrous had been unaware of it all. He then wondered if his foresight, instead of being eliminated, had been twisted in upon itself, forcing him to endlessly relive his own death. It was all a cruel joke. Tenebrous had finally acquired immortality, but not as he had wanted. Now trapped in an endless loop of death, Tenebrous' consciousness still lives on in this hell, a hell of his own creation, without even a mouth with which to scream. And so, what's up guys, and welcome back to the channel. The Ones of Mortis have been in the galaxy for a very long time, presumably hundreds of years. The daughter, the representative of the light side of the Force, the son, the representative of the dark, and the father, the balance between the two of them. Their roles in the galaxy and the Force itself is complex, but it's clear that they're more so representatives, rather than the entire embodiment of the forces that they represent. In the Mortis arc, the father has comments to Anakin Skywalker that this was not his true form, but rather the physical form that they chose to represent where they stand. Their truest forms are within the Force itself. These higher beings are exceptionally powerful and interesting to the lore, and with this, we have sought through many pages of Star Wars comics, both legends, canon, as well as novels, to indicate who exactly knew of the existence of the gods of Mortis. What were these individuals' thoughts on these extremely powerful Force deities? And today, my friends, we have found the particularly interesting writings of Darth Plagueis the Wise from two sources today, the first of which coming from the Book of the Sith as compiled and written by Darth Sidious, and the second from the Darth Plagueis novel itself. However, in the novelization, Plagueis refers to them as Celestials rather than the gods of Mortis. In the Book of the Sith, we have the section of Darth Plagueis. Most of the writings involve the grand plan of the Sith and how Plagueis envisions his galaxy as its ultimate emperor. Plagueis believed that he would attain ultimate power in the Force through more scientific methods, especially his study and manipulation of the midichlorians. Sidious's plan, which was part successful, was to manipulate the midichlorians to cast a large and foreboding shadow over the Force itself, the cloud that the Jedi describe over the course of the Clone Wars, a cloud that they cannot pierce through. Plagueis' plan was to manipulate the midichlorians, his own in fact, to create life, essentially becoming a god, and with his fascination of becoming a god led him to more teachings, especially those who had already become divine themselves, specifically the gods of Mortis. But rather, Plagueis had an interesting take on them. Speaking about the gods of Mortis, Plagueis' comments are directly intertwined with that of the Jedi Chosen One prophecy. Plagueis is one of the few individuals in the entire galaxy intelligent enough to see that the Chosen One prophecy and the gods of Mortis were directly intertwined, able to pierce through the intention, realizing that the Mortis god story, at least to him, was an allegory for the Force itself. But where Plagueis made a major mistake is spitting in the face of the prophecy of the Chosen One and the gods of Mortis. He believed that these were false teachings, stories that the Jedi would tell themselves to be able to sleep at night, knowing that the Sith were still likely out there somewhere among the stars, biting power, hunting the Jedi Order in the shadows at every move, fracturing it whenever possible. This was a fatal mistake on behalf of Plagueis. He was insanely intelligent enough to understand what the true meaning of the Ones of Mortis were, but instead, he threw it away as myth. Plagueis first describes the story of the Ones of Mortis as simple storytelling by Jedi mystics. At first, Plagueis comments about the very state of where Mortis would exist in the galaxy, stating that the planet itself residing there in the star maps would be impossible. As we would later come to learn from the Clone Wars, Mortis is only revealed to those that the gods seek to reveal themselves to, such as when the Chosen One arrived on the world. Plagueis concluded that the story of the gods of Mortis would be one that the Jedi would tell themselves in times of great darkness, a story of hope that they would all needlessly cling to when the Sith would eventually gain total control. He stated that any Jedi that believed in this was a fool, and he saw the clear connection to the path of the Chosen One itself. Interestingly here, Plagueis disregards everything having to do with the Mortis gods because he directly links it to the Jedi Chosen One, and anything Jedi related, Plagueis deems outright foolish, especially such tales as one that would bring balance to the Force and utterly obliterate the Sith. Plagueis believed this to be utterly impossible until he would sense the very boy of Anakin Skywalker in the Phantom Menace. But of course, these writings from Darth Plagueis concerning the Ones of Mortis happened decades before Anakin's arrival to Coruscant, and it's likely that upon sensing the very presence of Anakin, Plagueis' very thoughts about Mortis would have likely changed. Unfortunately though, we never get to learn of this directly, as it's never brought up or addressed in the Plagueis novel. But that doesn't mean that the arrival of the Chosen One didn't make Plagueis question his thoughts on Mortis, and the idea that the Ones of Mortis were not simply a Jedi story, but rather could actually be entities that existed. And perhaps speculative, in the final days of Darth Plagueis, he realized that instead of seeking to dominate the midichlorians, he was looking for power in all the wrong places. Plagueis is known for discounting things as myth extremely quickly, far more quickly than his apprentice would in Darth Sidious, who we learn thanks to Star Wars Rebels actually knew of the ones of Mortis and believed in their prophecy and tale. Palpatine even gained access to the world between worlds, and this is ultimately where Plagueis fell short. Plagueis didn't even believe that there were any dark side spirits left on the world of Korriban. Even when one directly appeared to him, he simply believed it was a trick, and that the Sith Lord was growing tired. This again leads into one of the greatest weaknesses of Plagueis himself, his own thoughts that he is the supreme being in the Force and is completely infallible. The concept that anything was above Plagueis, even the Force and the midichlorians itself, was beyond his understanding. He viewed himself as the Sith Chosen One, the Sith Ari, and eventually believed that he would be the ultimate being within the Force itself, able to manipulate the midichlorians at will, to stop himself and anybody else from dying, to mold and shift the galaxy in his own image. Plagueis thought himself a false god, and the idea that there were three beings above Plagueis' own perceived godhood made no sense to the Sith Lord. Plagueis even used this to elevate himself above the Jedi, stating that the Jedi still believed in old stories and superstition, where Plagueis believed in science and the study of the Force itself, using this self-praise to elevate himself further. In the Darth Plagueis novel, Plagueis also reminisces of the idea of representatives of the Force, and although he does not name them directly, instead referring to them as Celestials, we do believe he is in some manner speaking of the ones of Mortis, especially since the ones of Mortis are considered to be ancestors of the Celestials. Plagueis talks about the Celestials as architects of the galaxy, individuals that after creating the very galaxy itself joined with the Force, achieving perfect harmony and balance. This is exactly how Plagueis saw himself. However, instead of service to the Force would be in service to Plagueis. He would dominate and join with the Force just as these ancient Celestials had, but instead of the Force reigning supreme, it would be the Order of Sith. Plagueis believed that if these stories were true, and he believed that the idea of the Celestials might be where the ones of Mortis were not, that the Celestials may have determined the very state of the galaxy itself, becoming the Force itself. Plagueis believed that perhaps this is what godhood had in store for him, a new architect of a new universe potentially. In the end though, to Plagueis, these were just simple theories, and the fact of the matter is, unfortunately, the idea and the concepts of the ones of Mortis were above Plagueis' train of thought. The study of these higher concepts of the Force is not only something that Plagueis disliked, he outright hated it. He believed that even the teachings of ancient Sith masters, which he could confirm did live, were useless to the power that he himself would attain. Plagueis, in many ways, was the ultimate Star Wars narcissist, and it was because of this that at the perfect moment, Darth Sidious, Lord of the Sith, would strike him down, himself none the wiser. But with this raises an exceptionally interesting question. What would have Darth Plagueis' thoughts on the ones of Mortis been if he had lived past the Phantom Menace? If he had learned that Anakin Skywalker was indeed the Chosen One? Would his thoughts on the higher mysteries of the Force open themselves up to Plagueis? In the end, they were never meant to. But
Welcome, traveler, back to the archives. We've been expecting you. Darth Sidious, the Dark Lord of the Sith, is known to be the most pure evil being, the devil incarnate of Star Wars. His sinister behavior and insidious plots have placed him among the most powerful and most accomplished beings in the entire galaxy, as well as one of the most depraved Sith. But what if the tables were turned? What if at the very beginning, Sheev Palpatine was found by the Jedi and indoctrinated into the Jedi Order? This is a question that a handful of people have asked and have even speculated on, and it's one that is quite difficult to answer. With the existence of a Jedi Knight Sheev Palpatine comes the existence of many variables and many more questions to be answered. One of the most popular of these questions is, would he be as powerful? However, we are not actually here to ask these questions, but rather to answer at least one. That being, why Palpatine would have been a terrible Jedi, and more specifically, why he was destined to be a part of the dark side since the very beginning. Our source today comes from the Darth Plagueis novelization, from Plagueis himself, where he states that there is reason to believe that in not a single universe, if ever possible, with Palpatine being a Jedi ever turning out to be a good thing. And in fact, Plagueis speculates he may have ended up causing another great schism in the Jedi, so let's go ahead and open up the holocron today, uncovering this fascinating prediction by Plagueis and filling in the blanks with lore ourselves. Let us discover the truth of Palpatine's destiny. The Palpatine bloodline was a family of aristocrats and politicians living the high life of wealth on Naboo. The patriarch of the family was named Kasinga Palpatine, who was heavily involved in the political sphere of their home world, and had a heavy hand in how things played out leading up until the Battle of Naboo in 32 BBY. What's most interesting perhaps about the Palpatine bloodline is Sheev Palpatine is the first in the entire line to ever be Force sensitive, or have been noted to have been Force sensitive, with Sheev being so strong in the Force in fact that his father Kasinga mentioned how strange of a child he was even as an infant, noting that he caused odd things to happen around him. Most children don't exactly start showing signs of manifesting the Force until they're around toddlerhood, so Palpatine was showing signs extremely early. Of course, Sheev Palpatine's midichlorian count clocks in at a whopping 20,000. For reference, Yoda's midichlorian count, the highest recorded in the Jedi Order besides Anakin, is 18,000. And it really is a wonder that the Jedi didn't find Palpatine as a young boy, but we can thank Palpatine's father, Kasinga, for that. The Palpatine patriarch notoriously despised the Jedi, thinking them all of a bunch of weirdos. So knowing very little about the Force, but recognizing it within his son, Palpatine's father paid exorbitant amounts of money in order to cover up his son's Force sensitivity, and to make sure that the Jedi stayed far away from his son. The reason for this being is that he couldn't bear the shame that he believed it would bring on his family if his son were discovered to be anything less than normal. So this was why Sheev was never actually found by the Jedi. This, along with his innate ability to cloud his presence in the Force. We know that Sheev growing up basically lived life without any sort of moral compass whatsoever. He learned at an early age that strong got to do whatever they pleased, because anytime he caused trouble, he wouldn't have any consequences since his father would just bribe people to cover it up and keep him out of prison, or worse. There was even a case early on in his life where young Palpatine killed 2 pedestrians in a speeder accident, getting away with no punishment, and notably, no remorse either, with Palpatine even noting that this was strange, but of course shrugging it off because he did not care of the opinions of lesser, even before he indoctrinated himself as a Sith, a fascinating realization. This was in fact a story that he would share with Plagueis when the two of them became very good friends. In the end, Plagueis would quote perfectly to Sheev what he was. This is what Darth Plagueis said to the boy. And of what possible use do you think a person of your nature would be to the Jedi Order? You are heartless, ambitious, arrogant, insidious, and without shame, nor empathy. All of this points to Palpatine's character to be sure, but many might say that it was simply a product of how he was raised. Perhaps if Palpatine was found as an infant, he could be different. But according to Sheev's father, that may have been a very different case. Kasinga mentions to his son that when he tried to swaddle Sheev as an infant, the boy fought him with strength far too powerful for someone his size. At that point, Kasinga knew something was wrong with the boy, and he had himself tested to make sure that Sheev was actually his legitimate son. He had hated his son for this. Growing up, young Palpatine would look at his father with nothing more than hatred, disdain, and murderous intent, furious that he could not act upon his urges. What's notable is Palpatine's own mother never says something very noteworthy about her son whatsoever. With that said, the idea of someone being practically born as evil is usually a subject of intense debate. The nature versus nurture argument has to play a role in the deliberation about Palpatine's destiny, but perhaps the dark side of the Force did choose him. However, it has actually been pretty much confirmed about Sheev as a person. He is a clinical psychopath. Mental illness is something that is quite often overlooked in the Star Wars galaxy, but it does play a significant part of a person's use and alignment to the Force. The Jedi train their younglings in the same doctrine for all species and kinds, but there are just some that are not destined for the Jedi way. If someone is ambitious, cunning, or passionate, that eventually does show in their Jedi training. Take Dooku for example. Despite the fact that he was left to die in the woods by his father, who too was ashamed of him, he eventually grew up to be a noble and a valiant Jedi, leading with grace and posture. This caused him to be a social outcast among many of his classmates, and I believe Palpatine would have been the same. Unfortunately though, there is one difference between Dooku and Palpatine. Palpatine lacks empathy and compassion entirely. His ambition will always counteract any attempt at peace, and he may always harbor feelings of hatred for his father for throwing him away. Not to mention, his extremely high potential in the Force would manifest in pure arrogance. He would likely form a natural rivalry with Yoda and butt heads with Windu. The strict mandates and rules of the Council would begin to get under his skin, especially when he attained the rank of Knight. Like Qui-Gon and Dooku, the Council would chastise his methods, and soon, like all fallen Jedi before him, Palpatine would become less enthusiastic about the Council, and far more interested in the Sith holocrons hidden below the archive vault. Dooku himself as a young Padawan viewed forbidden Sith knowledge, and if Dooku did it, you can absolutely bet that Palpatine would too, using his charisma to bring a whole host of Jedi with him, and effectively becoming the second coming of Exar Kun. What has always been fascinating about the character of Darth Sidious is he was literally born to be a Sith, something that Darth Plagueis himself recognizes. Darth Plagueis never intended to take upon himself an apprentice, viewing himself as the culmination of Bane's rule of two, but he had never seen a being so perfectly suited for the Sith Order as Palpatine was, and he could not deny its ravenous calls. Perhaps even if Palpatine were a Jedi, Plagueis would seek him out and train him, attempting to manipulate him the same way that Sidious would do to Anakin. Perhaps the only difference in the Plagueis novel is that Plagueis finds him as a Jedi and not as a nobleman's son on the world of Naboo. Perhaps this iteration of Palpatine with Jedi training could become even more powerful. But anyway, my friends, ancient Sith are a topic that we often draw upon to gain a full understanding of the dark side. Their knowledge and dark wisdom is what shaped the Sith Order into what it eventually became. Each individual Dark Lord offered what they could in the pursuit of progressing the Sith, and of course, their own rule. One of the most valuable commodities among the Sith, and even the Jedi for other reasons, is the holocrons of the Sith of old. The knowledge contained within them is key to many victories for the Dark, and the path to power and understanding within the dark side beyond what anyone can find anywhere else. But not every Sith shared this sentiment and opinion of the ancient Sith holocrons. In fact, one of our favorite Sith, Darth Plagueis, who was ever the contrarian, actually disliked learning from the ancients, and Plagueis even went as far as not permitting his apprentice, Darth Sidious, to study from their manuscripts either during his training. This is quite different from any other Sith that has come before Plagueis, as they all emphasize the study of the ancients in order to understand and respect where all of the Sith came from. However, Plagueis had a different idea, and it may in fact have actually been brilliant to not have Sidious study the ancient Sith holocrons too early in his training, and could have even made Sidious into a much stronger and wiser version than he was. So my friends, let's open up a holocron of our own and reveal the secrets of Plagueis not permitting Sidious to study from the ancient Sith. Our source today comes from the Darth Plagueis novelization, when Sidious is in some of his early days of training, and Plagueis is taking him on a few field trips to various worlds. At this point in his training, Plagueis had given Sidious some documents that gave a general overview of Sith history and the stories of some of the most prominent members of the Order. However, Plagueis didn't give Sidious any of the holocrons to study, or anything else for that matter. In actuality, Plagueis really didn't have Sidious studying very much at all, but rather trained him in a far more hands-on approach, giving him a taste of the dark side not from books and texts, but from first-hand experience. Although Sidious later shows interest in learning from the old Sith by desiring to visit their planets of old instead of the ones that Plagueis had been showing him, this is what Plagueis had to say about the ancients and their old, dead worlds. You, Sidious, are impatient. Your hunger for power of the sorts you imagine is to be found on Korriban, Dromund Kaas, and Zagula. As a side note here, all three of the worlds that Plagueis mentions here were at one point in time incredibly valuable to the Sith Empire. Korriban was the birthplace of the Sith. Dromund Kaas was the capital of the Sith Empire in its heyday whenever the Great Galactic War was occurring, and Zygula is one of the least talked about, but most fascinating Sith worlds. On Zygula, there was a powerful temple that was constructed by the Order of the Sith Lords. In this temple held a trove of Sith artifacts and knowledge. It was kept secret from the Jedi for many, many years, and was one of the last places in the galaxy that was purely, still, completely dark-sided origins. If you would like a full holocron on the world of Zygula, please leave a like and request it in the comments below. But now, onto the topic at hand. Plagueis specifically did not want to take Palpatine to Zygoula, since according to legends, it still hadn't been discovered at this point by the Jedi either, and wouldn't until much later in the Clone Wars, being found when Obi-Wan Kenobi and Bail Organa located it by mistake. But we digress. This is what Plagueis continues to teach his apprentice. If you are so curious, then let me tell you what you'll encounter in these reliquaries. You will find Jedi, treasure hunters, and legends. Of course there are tombs in the Valley of the Dark Lords, but they have been plundered and now draw only tourists. On Duxun, Yavin 4, and Ziost, the same you will find is true. If it's history that has caught your fancy, then I can show you 100 worlds in which esoteric Sith symbols have been woven covertly into the architecture and culture. I can bore you for years on tales of Frida Nad, Belia Darzu, and Darth Zana, who is alleged to have infiltrated the Jedi Temple, as well as of starships imbued with Sith consciousness. Is that your wish, Sidious, to become an academic? Once Plagueis' rant is over, Sidious simply implies that he only wishes to learn. Plagueis replies with that it is far better to learn in the here and now rather than look in the past for knowledge and power. The power that they desired could only be found by manipulating the present, and the presence was politics and the arrogance of the Jedi. Curiously, Palpatine then asks Plagueis if he should be distrustful of the legends of the ancient Sith, to which Plagueis responds with a fascinating explanation. Not distrustful, but holocrons contain knowledge specific and idiosyncratic to each Sith who constructed them. Real knowledge is passed by master to apprentice in sessions such as this, where nothing can be diluted nor forgotten. There may come a time, Sidious, when you may wish to console the holocrons of the past masters, but until then, you would do better not to be influenced by any of them. You must discover the dark side in your own way, and perfect power in your own fashion. I must say, I do not often agree with a lot of the things that Plagueis preaches, and many of his views on the Force. However, Plagueis shows great wisdom here in not having Sidious study any of the knowledge of the ancient Sith and their biased information. But this also teaches Sidious something else. Plagueis himself passes on thoughts and knowledge that are full of biased information, and by denying Sidious the ancient holocrons, it teaches him to think for himself, even when concerning the teachings of his very master. One of the main points is Plagueis doesn't believe in Sith spirits or life after death, since he was unable to observe or test either of these facts personally. However, we do know that much later, Darth Sidious very much would believe in a life after death and a Sith spirit, eventually proving as much. Plagueis taught his apprentice a great truth and a great power to seek the dark side through personal experience and experimentation, lining up with who Darth Plagueis is, a scientist. When Plagueis rhetorically asks Sidious if he wanted to become an academic, this is brilliant. Plagueis is making the point that the Sith, they are not cultists or scholars. They are changers, conquerors, and rulers. They do not merely study power, they are power. Knowledge of this sort can only be attained by trial and experience. Just like how most scientific breakthroughs require the scientists to experiment and to test theories in order to gain more understanding. Plagueis believed that the old Sith contained outdated views and happenings of old, dead eras, and by not allowing Sidious to study them in his youth and during his training, what Sidious's master effectively did was open up a path for him to gain more power by claiming it all through his own search of the darkness. Plagueis taught Sidious to take authority for his own power, execute his own plans, build his own empire. That is why, as we examine the Empire, it is all Darth Sidious. Nothing has influenced him from the past Sith Lords. This is purely Palpatine's vision. Everyone in Sidious's empire was replaceable, built by his own design, able to siphon everything he wanted from them and offered nothing in return. This was not something that Sidious had learned from an old holocron, but only something that he, Sheev Palpatine, shrewd senator of Naboo, Grand Chancellor, Emperor, could have inserted into his own Sith order. With all of that said, Emperor Palpatine had a massive fascination with ancient Sith knowledge for his own personal interest and even entertainment, and he very much did use much of their information to craft future plans. but the foundation of Darth Sidious was completely his own. However, for example, Sidious would get the Blackwing virus from Darth Tenebrous, and from various other sources, he would piece together the knowledge of Darth Endedu and Darth Bane of essence transfer, not to mention the ability to conjure a Force storm, and many other horrific experiments and discoveries. But with all of that said, the foundation in the dark side was all of his own. But of course,
greetings, wise acolytes of the Force, and welcome back to the archives. Darth Plagueis was certainly one of the most fascinating Sith to ever come from the Order's history. His views on the galaxy and the Jedi, as well as on the Force itself, have been in opposition to almost every other being that existed before Plagueis. Darth Plagueis was a man who absolutely rejected the notion that the Force was a mystery, stating that it is only a mystery to those who are too weak to interfere with it or seek out the whole truth, deeming these Sith that refuse to do so inferior. His denigration of the mystical side of the Force has stoked the ire of many scholars of the Force, including his own apprentice, Sidious. In the past, we have recorded holocrons about his wild experiments, and how at one point, the Force came to outright hate Darth Plagueis. In all honesty, it is highly unlikely that anyone truly cared much for Darth Plagueis besides his droid, 11-4D, and that's probably a product of Plagueis' rather dry and radical takes on the Force itself, and what and how the Sith should represent themselves. This brings us to the topic of today's video. Among several of the Dark Scientist's most controversial statements, there exists one that implies that Plagueis actually looks down on Sith that began as Jedi. He goes as far to imply that the Jedi who turned to the dark side and became Sith are merely pretenders, and that they don't fully understand the dark side since they didn't embrace it from the very beginning. For this analysis, we invite you to come along with us as we examine the words of Darth Plagueis and try to break down his point of view to see if there's actually any truth in it. So now, without further ado, let us open this holocron and begin. The whole source of today's video comes from a quote from the Darth Plagueis novel. The quote goes as follows: "Propelled by fear or hatred, even a Jedi can pass beyond the constraints of the Order's teachings and discover power of a more profound sort. But no Jedi who arrives at this place, who has risen above his or her allegiance to peace and justice, who kills in anger or out of desire, can lay real claim to the dark side of the Force. Their attempts to convince themselves that they fell to the dark side, or that the dark side compelled their actions, are nothing more than pitiful rationalizations. That is why the Sith embraced the dark from the start, focusing on the acquisition of power. We make no excuses. The actions of a Sith begin from the self and flow outwards. We stalk the Force like hunters, rather than surrender like prey to its enigmatic whims." End quote. So, right here we have quite a loaded statement. Plagueis is saying in effect that the Jedi who have suddenly tapped into the dark side by letting their emotions out haven't actually found the dark side, but rather are dancing on the very edge. He means exactly what he says: power of a more profound sort for true Sith. We are fairly certain that we understand what Plagueis means by this statement, as he isn't yet referring to the Jedi that have committed to the study of the dark side, but merely those who have used their emotions with the Force and achieved more power by sheer accident and by falling upon the dark side. For a good example of this, look no further than Obi-Wan Kenobi in The Phantom Menace, when Obi-Wan was suddenly emboldened by the death of Qui-Gon to tap into his emotional reserves and give Maul a real challenge. His emotions did blind him though, and he was pushed off the edge into the reactor shaft. But then, he was able to once again call upon his emotion and the Force in order to leap out and slice Maul in half. Kenobi was certainly using his anger in this moment, but I am still skeptical to say that he was actually using the dark side. In that moment, he gave himself over to the feelings of loss and pain of his master whom he loved, and whom he loved like a father, and was gutted right in front of him. Obi-Wan got dangerously close to the dark side in this moment, but managed to refrain from going all the way in. In fact, even Obi-Wan himself later says that his biggest pull to the dark side was actually against a group of Tusken Raiders, not against Darth Maul. Anyway, other Jedi who have experienced something similar, that being giving into emotion for a brief moment only to discover a sudden burst of power, all believe that they have suddenly fallen to the dark side, and this is simply not true, and this is something that we agree with Plagueis on, and something that frankly enrages Plagueis. The Dark Lord is saying that these beliefs are pitiful rationalizations so that they won't have to face the reality that their teachings are holding the Jedi back. Plagueis then goes on to talk about how the Sith have embraced power from the very start by simply dropping all pretense about the situation and admitting to just being selfish and being perfectly happy with the fact that they are dark side creatures. But I think it is simply the way that he talks about how they embrace the dark side from the start and focusing on the acquisition of power, and then that they make no excuses. This tells us that there is more going on in the mind of Darth Plagueis than what he is actually saying. So let's explain what we mean by this. What we stated a moment ago about what Plagueis said regarding Jedi who dipped into higher power is certainly true, but I think that Plagueis is actually double speaking here. He may be referring to Jedi like this, but the undertones of what he is saying reveals something much deeper, a hidden contempt for Sith who began as Jedi. So why exactly do we say this? Well, think about what Plagueis said. We embrace the dark from the start. We make no excuses. He's throwing a very subtle insult at Sith who began as Jedi, basically saying that their sob stories and tragic backstories are something that they use as an excuse and a rationalization for dipping into the dark side and ultimately becoming Sith. Plagueis finds them to be inferior since they didn't embrace the dark side from the start. Perhaps he believed Jedi who become Sith are simply lying to themselves and are wanting to appear more noble than they actually are, a trait carried over from their beginnings as Jedi. To many, their perspective can come off as pretty unfair and even callous, but we have to remember what Darth Plagueis is actually saying, and who Darth Plagueis is. Plagueis comes from the prestigious Moon species, a people whose entire culture is built upon class, not to mention status, wealth, and elitism. Moons and Plagueis especially tend to look down on every other creature. These vain habits cause Plagueis' ego to become quite inflated to the point that he starts to adhere to these ideas, and ideas such as this, that those who were born into the darkness, those who didn't drop everything and accept it from the start, were somehow inferior. Here's another thing we have to remember about Plagueis though. Plagueis was literally born to be a Sith. His master, Darth Tenebrous, actually had sought out two of the most promising Force-sensitive specimens with a high enough midichlorian count, a male and a female Moon from the Damask family. Tenebrous manipulated them into getting together so that they could bear a child for him to claim as his apprentice. Plagueis was a bred Sith. This plan worked out flawlessly, and they produced an heir who they named Qui-Gon Damask, who Tenebrous stole from childhood and trained in the ways of the dark side for him to eventually become Darth Plagueis. From this story, it becomes glaringly clear that Plagueis has a superiority complex, believing that because he had been chosen by darkness from the very beginning, he was destined to be the greatest Sith that has ever lived. He did not fall upon this, he was born into it. This is likely why we hear so many of the controversial and egotistical statements from him. He had assumed that he was going to be the last Sith anyway, so it didn't really matter what he thought about the Sith beforehand. Perhaps Plagueis also rationalized this, since the Jedi who fell to Sithhood wasn't a Sith from the beginning, and they might have had a lot of bias and baggage carried over from their time as Jedi. But of course, the problem here is that Plagueis is verifiably dead wrong. Almost every single Jedi that ever became a Sith was one of the most successful and feared Sith in the entire order. Exar Kun, who Plagueis himself had mentioned once earlier with reverence, was a Jedi starting out, and he nearly brought the galaxy to its knees. He killed the Supreme Chancellor in broad daylight, destroyed the Jedi's homeworld, and was one of the greatest Sith sorcerers that have ever lived. Revan and Malak did far more for the Sith Order as a whole than many Sith Lords did back in the day. It was from them carrying over their Jedi understandings, and the Jedi understandings of a master and apprentice relationship that would spawn Bane's idea for the Rule of Two. Darth Ruin was a Jedi who caused the Fourth Great Schism, which would kickstart the entirety of the new Sith Wars, which lasted for thousands of years. The Sith Order as a whole was built upon the foundations laid by Dark Jedi, who left the Order during the Second Great Schism in the year 6900 BBY, and we need not go on. But the evidence here is overwhelming, to the contrary of what Plagueis actually assumes. In fact, we recorded a holocron not long ago about why Jedi who became Sith were actually often more powerful. Either way, Darth Plagueis had many radical ideas that are perhaps up for debate, but this specific argument made by the egotistical Plagueis, in our opinion, can be easily refuted. However, we want to know what you think about this.
Students of the Force, and welcome back to the channel, or welcome to the channel if it's your first time visiting. Several days ago, we did a video essay on why Qui-Gon Jinn was the only Jedi that Palpatine really feared could end his plan. However, this fear actually stemmed deeper back into his master
master, where there is actually a different reason why Darth Plagueis himself feared Qui-Gon Jinn, a much younger Jedi at the time. For 1,000 years, the Sith have been in hiding under the doctrine of the Rule of Two, as set in motion by Darth Bane. Around the time of the pre-Clone Wars era, Plagueis had selected Palpatine as his apprentice, and the winds of the Force were beginning to change. The actualization of the Sith plans were at hand, and Plagueis could feel it. Plagueis began to get involved more with galactic affairs, having a hand in politics through Palpatine, and even having a hand in the Jedi Order through his connections to Jedi such as Dooku and Sidious, being rather friendly with both of them. Darth Plagueis started setting the plans in motion after speaking with the Kaminoans and manipulating Master Sidious into commissioning them for the creation of the Clone Army. Everything appeared to be working in the Sith's favor. This was until Plagueis heard news from his apprentice, Palpatine, about the 9-year-old slave boy brought back from Tatooine by Jedi Master Qui-Gon Jinn. It was said that the boy was incredibly powerful in the Force, and that the Jedi were considering him to be the chosen one of ancient prophecy. In this moment, Darth Plagueis realized something, and he was struck with intense fear, not only for the boy, but for Qui-Gon. Qui-Gon Jinn had just become Sith enemy number 1. And this is why. To start, Plagueis was never a believer in the Chosen One prophecy at all, but what made him change his mind is the way that he felt through the Force whenever it balanced itself, as well as the way that Plagueis believed the Force itself worked when it balanced out. 9 years prior, Plagueis and Sidious performed a dark ritual in order to leave their mark on the Force and shift it into the dark side's favor for the time being, as the Sith believed that their plans were now on the horizon. However, what they did not know until now was that the Force fought back and forcibly balanced itself by forming into Anakin and bringing about the Chosen One of ancient prophecy. So what does this have to do with Qui-Gon? Plagueis had actually met Qui-Gon Jinn once before when he had a meeting on Sereno with his master Dooku. This meeting also included Sidious as well as Qui-Gon Jinn. Plagueis quickly discovered that Qui-Gon was a headstrong Jedi, very much unlike the rest of them, as Plagueis sensed he was very much like his master Dooku. However, something was different. Qui-Gon and Dooku both saw through the dogma and cracks in the Jedi Order. But unlike Dooku, Qui-Gon also fully realized the shortcomings and the selfishness of the Sith. Plagueis knew then that Qui-Gon Jinn, unlike Dooku, could not be swayed, and he was a powerful opponent, not just in the way of the Force and a lightsaber, but in influence and importance to the greater scheme of the galaxy. And what made Plagueis fear him even more, the greater schemes of the Force itself. Because of this, Darth Plagueis quickly left his home in a rare occasion in order to go find Anakin. This led him to where Anakin, Qui-Gon, and Obi-Wan had stopped to rest and had briefly docked. Standing from afar, Plagueis watched with the macro binoculars. He then decided to reach out with the Force to see if he truly felt anything special about Anakin. All of the sudden it came to him as he was accosted by visions, flashing in the future. A terrible vision. This is what the passage reads from the Darth Plagueis novel. He stretched out with the Force and fell victim to an assault of perplexing images. Ferocious battles in deep space, the clashing of lightsabers, partitions of radiant light, a black, helmeted cyborg rising from a table. By the time his gaze had returned, Qui-Gon and the boy had disappeared, trying to desperately make sense of the images granted to him by the Force. Plagueis fought desperately to repress the truth. The boy would change the course of history, unless Maul had to kill Qui-Gon to keep the boy from being trained. Qui-Gon was the key to everything, but perhaps the boy had already changed it. In the passage, we learn that Darth Plagueis has learned of the Clone Wars and even sees it. He sees Vader all before it ever happens, and he instantly knows that if Qui-Gon were to train the boy, Anakin would become everything of the Chosen One prophecy, and everything it was meant to be. It is no secret to us in the Star Wars community that we have known for a long time that Qui-Gon truly was the correct mentor and father figure for Anakin, and that no one else could have brought him into greatness as good as Qui-Gon Jinn could have. He would have understood the lies and the dogma of the Jedi, and been able to properly instruct Anakin on how to temper his emotions and truly use the balance of the Force the way it was meant to be. This is exactly why Plagueis was absolutely terrified of Qui-Gon Jinn as well as Anakin in this moment. he began to wonder if the Sith had been completely undone, and if the millennia of work for the rule of two had ultimately been for nothing, just because of one Jedi in Qui-Gon, a lowly single Jedi. He could not let this happen, so instead, he instructed that Maul had to kill Qui-Gon at all costs in order to protect everything that the Sith had built. If Darth Maul did not kill Qui-Gon Jinn in this moment, it would have all ended here. Anakin Skywalker would have been trained, perhaps, to be more than a Jedi, to use the Force itself, the cosmic and living Force, in tandem with one another in perfection. Anakin would have most definitely single-handedly potentially destroyed the Sith and brought balance to the Force yet again. Darth Plagueis realized just how dangerous Anakin Skywalker was, and how dangerous Qui-Gon was, and he even wanted Anakin to be killed. However, of course we know his apprentice, devious in his own right of course, had other plans for the young Skywalker. So friends, Emperor Sheev Palpatine is often regarded as one of the single most powerful Sith Lords in galactic history, laying siege to the entirety of the galaxy and ruling over his subjects with an iron fist for nearly 2 decades unopposed. His prowess in lightsaber combat and affinity within the Force has allowed him to go toe-to-toe with some of the most powerful Jedi Masters of his generation, both in terms of Force power as well as lightsaber combat. He dueled Grandmaster Yoda to a standstill, had the Force ability to mask his presence from the entirety of the Jedi Council, which are each incredibly respectable feats in their own right. Under the tutelage of his master, Darth Plagueis, Palpatine was able to become one of the most fearsome Sith Lords and proficient dark side users in history. But who in his generation did Plagueis regard with just as much respect as Palpatine? And who was there that Plagueis may have even preferred to train? Well, stick with us today, weary acolytes of the galaxy and students of the Force, and let's discuss the replacement that Plagueis would have sought in the event of Palpatine's death, as well as the individual that Plagueis desired to train before he met Palpatine. According to the Darth Plagueis novel, one of my favorite books of all time, in the event of Palpatine's untimely demise or his inability to continue with his duties and practices as a Sith Lord, for one reason or another, Plagueis would have pursued none other than Jedi Master Count Dooku as a replacement, with Plagueis considering him a worthy successor of the Sith title. This was due to a few different factors that Dooku showcased. These factors, which went beyond his simple prowess within the Force and his notoriety as one of the Jedi Order's greatest swordsmen. While his skill was certainly commendable, and Dooku was a well-respected and highly renowned Jedi Master, he wasn't particularly strict on the Jedi Code, and had an affinity for bending the rules to his own accord from time to time, a trait that was highly desirable by both Sith Lords, and something that would actually trickle over into Qui-Gon Jinn, Dooku's own apprentice. His flexible moral code meant that he could be more easily tempted to the dark side, as he saw later in his career, though the exact circumstances were a bit more complicated than the standard reasons why some join the Sith Order. Many Sith elect to join the ranks of dark side users for power or influence over the galaxy. Dooku, though, is unique. Other Sith given to motives of greed, lust, or a desire for control simply for the euphoria of having unmatched and unrivaled power over others. Dooku, however, craved the ability to make a legitimate change rather than simply rule a new kingdom over which he bore the crown. While Palpatine's iteration of the Empire was a fascist regime that constricted personal freedoms, he was also able to entice Dooku into joining his cause by tapping into Dooku's desire for forward progress and a better galaxy. Count Dooku believed that the Senate was ineffective and that the Jedi had completely lost their way, growing weak, which called for not only a purge of the current governmental system, but the re-establishment of a new force-wielding order. Though Dooku's new government would be far more benevolent and merciful than the Empire that we ultimately saw. In the very same Darth Plagueis novel, Palpatine has a conversation with Dooku before his turn to the dark side, and this dialogue showcases Dooku's desire to do good for the underprivileged of the galaxy and help those who are less fortunate than himself, the Jedi, and even the Sith. The exact excerpt from the novel goes as follows: "But that the disenfranchised worlds of the Outer Rim enjoy any support at all is largely due to you. You speak honestly, and you champion the underprivileged, and you may be the only one capable of bringing the Republic back from the brink. Unless, of course, you have been lying to me all these years." The interesting part of this, however, is that these traits not only made Dooku a point of interest interest for Palpatine upon the death of his first Padawan, but Dooku's behavior had enticed and even intrigued Darth Plagueis before him, showing that Dooku had embodied these traits for years, even decades, and was a highly touted and desired Sith prospect. Another quote from further into the novel showcases that Dooku has always had a different perspective on the Sith than most Jedi, even back in the days when he was a loyal master. To Palpatine again, Dooku says the following: "For many, the Sith are the embodiment of pure evil, but the Council knows differently. What separates a Sith from a Jedi is the way each approaches the Force. The Jedi Order has placed limits on itself, but the Sith have never shied away from incorporating the power of the dark side to accomplish their own goals." Palpatine then asks if Dooku wishes to learn the secrets of the dark side, to which Dooku replies, "I confess that I do." This showcases that the seeds were being set for Dooku's descent into the darkness, while Plagueis was still in power and the reigning Sith. And it's understandable as to why Plagueis would have been interested in Dooku as a prospective backup apprentice should his relationship with Palpatine ever sour. If Palpatine were left unable to continue his training due to either his death or some other factor, then Dooku not only would have been the next logical step, but Plagueis himself even confirmed as much personally. It's even interesting to note that Palpatine came to not only revere and respect Dooku as a worthy apprentice during the Clone War, but he even became weary that Dooku not only could, but might overthrow even the power of Palpatine. After contending with Master Yoda at the dawn of the Clone Wars, Palpatine saw Dooku in a brand new light, and came to even develop a latent sense of caution around his new Padawan and Sith apprentice. While Maul was little more than a pawn that Palpatine used to further his own agenda, Dooku might have been a credible threat to Palpatine's throne and power, and Palpatine knew this threat. As of now, it appears as if Dooku, at even 83 years of age, was the superior lightsaber combatant to that of Palpatine, at least concerning his fundamentals. While they were both able to contend in lightsaber combat with Grandmaster Yoda, Palpatine was bested by Mace Windu, or at least he was allegedly bested, who was often cited as Dooku's closest competitor in the realm of lightsaber combat. And it's not unreasonable to believe that Dooku would have contended with Palpatine in a duel. After developing a relationship with the Sith assassin Asajj Ventress, Palpatine became even more concerned that the two might elect to overthrow him, and therefore inherit the reign of the Sith for themselves. But Palpatine is too smart for this. In the end, this ultimately would have allowed Dooku to enact the governmental system that he himself wanted to see, and not enact Palpatine's vision. This is what led to Palpatine ordering the assassination of Ventress and causing the rift between herself and her master that would carry throughout the remainder of the Clone War, with the respect and esteem coming from not only Palpatine, but Darth Plagueis as well concerning Dooku. We are left to wonder what the truest potential of Dooku's reign as a Sith Lord could have ultimately been. Not only was Dooku respected by both Sith Lords of his generation, but he was only finally bested by the Jedi Knight who would come to replace him as Palpatine's next apprentice, the greatest Force wielder that had ever lived, showcasing that he was far more powerful and had far much more potential than might have been ultimately believed of him, or even immediately prevalent. Put some respect on Dooku's name. But anyway, my friends, did you know that Plagueis considered Dooku to be a worthy backup apprentice in case Palpatine died, and even considered making his apprentice before Plagueis' own demise? And what do you think would have happened if Dooku had actually been apprenticed to Darth Plagueis directly? And more than this, if Dooku was ever to allowed to become the one true master of the dark side and the Sith Order, what would Dooku's empire look like? As always, my friends, may the Force be with you. Thank you as always so much for watching, and have a great day.